Good morning, everybody. Happy May. Glad to be with all of you today. I am going to share slides, and these are slides that I'll make available after the presentation. So if you're seeing links or content that you want to go back to, there will be an opportunity for you to do that. There we go. Here is the cover slide. This is one of our Q&As. If you've been around, you have been to one of these before. I did want to thank you all for the great questions. You keep me busy with your questions, and I really benefit from the opportunity to hear those questions. So thank you. In our tradition, these are informal responses. So the nature of my responsibilities right now in my many jobs are such that I just don't have time to prepare like a full-blown detailed presentation. So these are like truly in the spirit of a quick Q&A, informal responses on slides that are not pretty. I know these slides are pretty, so please don't judge me, but hopefully still helpful to you. All right, so I'll dive into the first question or questions. Someone asked, can you share some best practices around blending for younger readers that are stuck? They can segment the sounds, but often can't blend the sounds back together, so more practice is needed. What practice shows the best impact on growth? Great question, and definitely a phenomenon that we see, especially in K and 1. So probably lots of you have experienced the same question, which is part of why I picked it. So of course, first things first, you want to make sure that children understand the task, that they understand that once you say the sound that is spelled by each letter or set of letters, that your job is to bring those sounds together. And you want to do a lot of modeling of that. And you can do that modeling both in context. So, as you're reading along, you can model, or teachers you work with can model the blending. And you can also do it out of context, just with individual words during your instruction. I know that it's tempting to think that if children are having trouble with phoneme blending, that you should do a lot of oral phoneme blending practice where you do things like say d, og, and then kids blend that to say dog. But actually, as we've said a number of times before in these sessions since 2016, as we've been saying, it's really more effective to do this kind of work with letters. You can have a short period of time where kids are using tokens or something like that, but pretty quickly you want to move to where kids have letters that are there with them as they are working on the blending. There is some research we shared with you a few years ago, for those of you who were there, suggesting that it does help children. This research was done with kindergartners. It does help children if in their early opportunities to blend or in their early work blending, that they're using more sounds that are continuant sounds, like stretchable sounds. So things like instead of sounds you can't stretch, or what are called stop sounds. So not like the sound commonly spelled by the letter G or the sound commonly spelled by the letter K, because those sounds can't be stretched. And it probably makes sense to you why the stretchability of the sounds makes it easier to blend them. So it's easier to blend man than it is to blend dog, because you're blending, you can stretch the sound into the next sound, if that makes sense. And so if you have children who are, as the questioner did, who are having, difficulty with blending, giving them more words that are comprised of continuant sounds, at least for the first two sounds in the word. For the third sound, it probably doesn't matter. So it could be like mat, for example, but at least for those first two sounds, using continuant sounds is helpful. Another strategy that is helpful, and this goes by different names. I actually usually call it slide as you go, but I think the field is more likely to call it blend as you go typically. But this is an approach where you have children blend the first two phonemes and then add the third phoneme in a 3-phoneme word. So, and actually this applies to words with more phonemes as well. So, but let me just give you an example. So let's say that the word is mat. Instead of going at mat, they would go mat, mat. Do you see what I'm saying? So they're blending two phonemes initially, just the first two phonemes, and then they're adding the third. So a way you could look at it is they're only ever trying to blend two phonemes or chunks at a time. So instead of having to remember the the a, and the t all at once, they only have to remember either and a for ma or ma and t. So they're only they're only getting the that's limiting how much that they have to hold in their phonological memory. So so blend as you go is a strategy that can be very helpful for kids who are having difficulty with that blending. And I've just talked it all through with you with 3 phonemes, but you can imagine the same, logic could apply to 4-phoneme words as well. Although if you have kids having trouble blending, you mostly should be working with 2-phoneme and 3-phoneme words anyway. Okay, and then the last technique, again, this is one, we shared this at the very first institute ever on the essentials back in 2016. So, this is been, and it was an old technique then. I mean, this technique's been around a long time, but it does have good research support from Charles Perfetti and colleagues of word ladders, or sometimes called word chains, but basically where you have a series of words and the words are changing only by 1 phoneme from line to line. And you don't have to be super strict with that, but that's usually how it is operationalized. So for example, they might change cat to can. They might change can to man. They might change man to tan, and so on. So you're changing one thing each time. And word ladders can be really helpful to kids who are having difficulty blending as well, because it's obviously sort of more of a spelling oriented technique to start. So it's really getting them deep into the phonemes in that way. But then when kids go back and they read their word ladders, they're not needing to remember as many changes each time. And so word ladders, they're just generally helpful, but they can especially be helpful for kids who are having difficulty with blending. So that's that one. I promise not all my answers are going to be that long. Okay, the next set of questions here, I would love to hear about research on pencil size for K1 writers. K writers are using standard size and first are using fat pencils. Does it matter? Your thoughts on golf size pencils? Those are those little short and very skinny pencils for our youngest writers. So there is research on this, believe it or not. So it's this is one study where they compared, this is sort of older, and I don't know if these are the rage anymore, but for a while, there was a lot of interest in these triangle pencils. You can kind of imagine how you could have the thinking that a triangular shaped pencil might be easier to have the correct finger placement. Anyway, there were triangular shaped pencils, a standard pencil, and then a thicker pencil, a large diameter pencil. And guess what? It made no difference. This was a pretty large study too, so I think we can be pretty confident that it made no difference. And then there's another study here. This is newer. This is a study where they were comparing a pencil to a keyboard to a stylus. So I thought you might be interested in that, even though that particular question wasn't there. And pencils, and these are standard pencils in kindergarten, standard pencils. Pencils were better than keyboard for kids' letter recognition and their visual spatial skills. The stylus was just as good as a pencil for those things, but the keyboard was better than the stylus for word reading and writing, and the pencil was sort of best of all for reading and writing. And so or at least it was equally good for reading and writing. So what does this tell us? This tells us that writing with a pencil, a standard pencil, had benefits over writing with a stylus and over typing with a keyboard. This is one study, but there's actually a fair bit of research, including some brain scan or fMRI research, that does suggest there's some real benefits to kids' handwriting in kindergarten over just keyboarding. And the stylus finding as well has been replicated in at least one other study that I can think of. The problem with styluses over pencils is probably the friction. Styluses don't have the same friction, they're designed to sort of glide over the tablet. So as some of you know, a team of us have been working actually on engineering a new stylus for young children that has various characteristics that matter to us, like being more durable for young children and having that higher level of friction while maintaining the girth and weight of a typical pencil. So I'm hoping that this is a temporary problem that can be fixed technologically, and we just need another year or two to do it. But in the meantime, at the least, what this study should reassure you of is that with kindergartners, you are perfectly able to use a standard pencil. It doesn't really matter if it's extra large or triangular or whatever else, and that doing so does hold benefits over only keyboard or only stylus-based writing. What does matter a lot is the grip. So just a quick reminder here of the two kinds of grips that are considered by most scholars in the field, as I understand it, to be grips that are appropriate for children, the tripod grip and the quadrupod grip, and those are illustrated here for you. And just in terms of that dynamic, you can see that you want to make sure that when children are writing that there is, they're not doing extreme movements with just their fingers. So that's kind of part of what, well, I think I won't get into all that. Okay. Now, grip support, there is remarkably little that I have found, although I'm not an occupational therapist, but I do follow this literature. I have not found much research on grip supports, which is disappointing. So my experience around grip supports is pretty experiential and not really based on research. So with that note, there are supports that can help children with their grip. So you can see this is one I just pulled off Amazon that some teachers I've worked with have used. It's just a trainer to train kids into the tripod grip. And then this is a teacher I worked with this year sent me these photos. So this is a type of grip support that some of you may have seen where there's like it actually goes around the wrist. There's also, where you hold part of the, you hold like a little object in your fingers, in the later fingers. And you can see the difference that she was able to show in this child's grip from just using one of those as well. So again, this is more anecdotal, but grip supports might be something to think about. I would go there before I would be altering the girth of the pencil to be really narrow or really large. Again, just not a lot of indication that that matters all that much. And, our goal is to get kids, being able to use a standard pencil. Okay. Another handwriting question. There were several for this round. Is there any research on using lined versus unlined paper for writing in kindergarten? I don't know of any research on this question. However, if any of you have ever been in crafts, like I'm a scrapbooker, it's actually my one hobby, or any of you have made signs or done anything like that, which is probably all of you, you know that if you try to write without lines, it is very challenging to keep your work from going like this or from going like this. And so that alone would suggest to me that probably lined paper for kindergarten is better. I will say that all of the handwriting programs that I'm aware of that have been tested in research and shown to be effective use lined paper in kindergarten. So I can say that I would pretty well, my very best guess from multiple sources would be that lined paper is the way to go. But again, no research that I know of where the only thing they compared for kindergartners was whether the paper was lined. All right, and the last handwriting set of questions, can you share expectations of handwriting? How should it be taught? What does it look like in K1 and future grades? Great question. And sorry, I know at least one of the people on this call has already seen this, but I just want to make a quick point about what we're even trying to do when we talk about handwriting. So handwriting is really, it's really evolved in our understanding of it over the last centuries. So it used to be that handwriting was very heavily, it was almost more about art, and it was called penmanship, you might remember, or your hand. And it was very oriented toward the visual, the aesthetic of the handwriting. And I don't think that any scholars in handwriting today see that as the key issue. So the three things that research would suggest to us matter in handwriting are actually automaticity, efficiency, and legibility. So automaticity is just like, you want to have such cognitive and mental memory and such muscle memory for handwriting that you don't have to be thinking about it. So we're trying to get kids to the point where they're not really thinking about their handwriting, because we actually have plenty of other things that we want them to be thinking about when they're writing, as you know. So automaticity is really about that, making it truly automatic for a child. Efficiency is about being able to be quick in your letter formation. And this isn't something that used to be emphasized at all historically, but now we understand that writing fluency, just how fast you can, get those letters down, is significant. And I think probably all of you would agree. And then legibility. So rather than everything being perfectly formed and beautiful and all that, it's about, can people read it? Is it legible? And so that's the third component. And so when you're designing or your handwriting instruction or making choices about handwriting professional learning or handwriting programs, these are the factors you want to be thinking about. So just to get a little more concrete then, so first of all, time. The What Works Clearinghouse Practice Guide in Developing Effective Elementary Writers says 10 to 15 minutes a day. I try to go on the shorter side of that myself, but that's their recommendation, 10 to 15 a day. Like almost anything you teach, you want to be using a gradual release of responsibility. So you would review with teachers that, we have our explicit instruction. And this gradual release, by the way, is in the What Works Clearinghouse Practice Guide in Developing Effective Elementary Writers, if you wanted to review it. But, the explicit instruction, the modeling, the coached sort of collaborative practice, the guided practice, and then being able to do it independently. So you want to make sure that those phases are all in there. You won't be surprised to hear me say, as I have many times with many other things like this, like when we've talked about, it's so important that every teacher call the punctuation mark the same thing. Not one teacher calls it excited mark, and the next year it's called exclamation mark, and the next year it's called exclamation point. Same with letter formation. So really, you need to have agreement, if at all possible, among all the teachers in the school you coach or schools you coach, about the language they're going to use, so that kids aren't getting a different description of how to form the letter, or worse yet, a different way of forming the letter from year to year. So this should absolutely be consistent across the school. And then you want to be thinking about grade level expectations. So the verdict is out on just how much handwriting instruction and the nature of it in pre-K. What at least one program that has been tested in pre-K suggests, and what I believe also from just extrapolating from other studies and experiences, is that at pre-K, what you really want to be working on, are your strokes, so kids learning to make curved lines, straight lines, vertical, horizontal, diagonal lines, hook lines. So you want kids to just get into the strokes very well, but you don't necessarily need to do formal formation instruction where they're like practicing. I mean, I would encourage you not to, until research tells us otherwise, not doing like formal handwriting instruction where they're practicing the same letter over and over again or anything like that. Save that for K. So in pre-K, you're working on strokes. The other big thing you can do in pre-K is the vocabulary. So if the letter formation approach that you have chosen with your K2 teachers that you work on includes the word hump or bump or diagonal or across or whatever words are in the formation language you've decided on, those words should be shared with your pre-K teachers so that they can be developing that vocabulary. Because if kids don't know what across means, it's not going to do them a lot of good in kindergarten to get that formal language, right? Oh, sorry. So that's pre-K. Then in K and 1 is when you're going to do the 10 to 15 minutes a day on handwriting. Doesn't have to be whole class, like the explicit explanation could be whole class and the kids can be practicing and getting some coaching in small group and independent practice, independently. But in K and 1, handwriting instruction will be like part of your goals in your day. In second grade, I think most folks in the field would say that at that point, it's just kids who need additional, intervention. So basically tier 2 handwriting, if you want to think about it that way. So by second grade, it would just be tier 2 handwriting. And I think most places that do cursive and most state laws that address cursive and so forth, that starts in third. So you're out of my jurisdiction by what to do on the whole course of teaching cursive. But for second grade, it would just be tier 2. Okay. And then you want to make sure that the practice you're providing is both out of context practice and in context practice. And that's really emphasized in the What Works Clearinghouse practice guide as well. Like we've all seen it where kids can write a letter really well on their handwriting practice sheets or their worksheets, but then in context, it all falls apart, right? But in context is our actual goal. So we got to make sure we have in context support. But out of context has a place as well. And the worksheet that I've put here on the screen or the practice sheet, I just want to point out a couple things about it. The first is notice that there's a model letter on the left and the right, left and right. Why is that? Because left-handed kids will cover the model if you only have the model on the left. So I can't tell you how many handwriting worksheets you will see in the world and how many teachers pay teachers, which hopefully none of you have teachers using anymore. But if you do, how many teachers pay teachers handwriting worksheets only have the model letter on the left? And that means left-handed children are covering up the model letter while they're trying to write the letters. And that's actually one of the theories about why children who are left-handed typically have lower rated handwriting. So please make sure you have model letters on the right-hand side as well as the left-hand side of the paper. The other thing I want you to notice is this is not a page of Fs. Why is that? Well, the What Works Clearinghouse practice guide in developing effective elementary writers actually says only 5 to 8 repetitions per practice session. So you actually shouldn't be seeing, again, they're all over Teachers Pay Teachers, but you should not actually be seeing a handwriting worksheet where the kid is forming a letter for the whole page. You shouldn't be seeing that. It's 5 to 8 times per letter is what is recommended by experts in this area. All right. Well, that was a lot about handwriting. Now I'm going to move on to this question, another excellent question. Someone's looking at the Common Core State Standards, and that in and of itself deserves applause because I feel like we don't always look at those as much as we should, but in the Common Core State Standards, they call for, in kindergarten, at the end of the year, kids to be able to read emergent reader texts with purpose and understanding. And the question is, well, what is an emergent reader text? And how do teachers best assess if a kindergarten student can read an emergent text with purpose and understanding? Great questions. Okay, so, when it comes to the Common Core, a lot of key terms aren't defined right in the document. So we have to kind of go to other sources to figure out what might have been meant. And I chose this source because it includes David Lieben, and David Lieben was involved in the writing of Common Core. So I feel like there's a level of, authority that comes with that. And so at this link, again, I'll share these slides so you'll have these links. They do define emergent reader texts, and they say emergent reader texts are phonetically controlled texts, i.e., and they mean e.g., for example, not i.e., that is. For example, the cat sat on a hat, such as those used in many kindergarten programs, or, and number 2 is predictable texts, i.e., again, I'm sure they mean e.g., Ms. Wishy-Washy saw a mop, Ms. Wishy-Washy saw a broom, such as those used in many kindergarten leveled readers. So this is the definition of emergent reader texts that they provide. One more quick note is phonetically is not the right word. It would be phonemically, but anyway, this is the basic idea. So I would argue against the second of the 2 types of text they use there as being what you focus on in trying to get children to this benchmark of emergent reader texts. And the reason that I would argue against that in part is actually right there in the example they gave, right? So, so in kindergarten, most of us would not yet have taught the title abbreviations, would not have taught Y as long E in word final position, right? Would not have taught this pronunciation of A. We would have taught short A, so wash. Would not have taught saw yet, certainly not have taught AW yet. So the only way is if we taught it as a high frequency word. A mop is okay. Again, wouldn't have taught this, wouldn't have taught this, wouldn't have taught this, wouldn't have taught this, wouldn't have taught this. And it's questionable whether you would have taught consonant clusters. Some curricula do that at the end, toward the end of kindergarten. Others don't start those till the beginning of first grade. But either way, in this case, spelling the sound oo, but also can spell the sound that's not something you would teach in kindergarten either. So if you choose this to be your benchmark text, then what you're doing is you're encouraging kids not to really, decode the words, but to use other tools to be able to read the book, right? And that's not really something that we want to do. We don't want to, we don't want to place a lot of emphasis on helping kids become good at predicting what the word might be from the picture or from the title or from the context or whatever. That's not going to have as much long-term benefit for children as focusing them on in kindergarten on really getting to that decoding. So I would argue that of the 2 types of emergent reader texts that were identified in that explanation that I shared, the ones I would go for are the ones that are texts primarily comprised of high frequency words and graphophonemic patterns that children have been taught. And this should look pretty familiar to you because in the first edition and the second edition of the Essentials, we make this point about kids having opportunities to read texts that reflect patterns that they've been taught. So quickly, I'm going to show you an example. I'm showing you an example from a curriculum that I'm involved in developing because that way I have the rights to share it. But this isn't the be all and end all. There are plenty of other texts like this that come from other programs and sources. Okay. So, but this is one. So you see the title is in it. Those are both words that we would hope children in kindergarten would have a good shot at being able to decode by the end of kindergarten, a short vowel consonant word. Skipping there. Okay. So this page says in a rock. So let's take a look. So, again, in short vowel consonant, would hope they'd be able to decode. A or depending on how you pronounce it, is a high frequency word we would expect that people have taught in kindergarten. The and the ah, as spelled as would be expected with instruction that would have already occurred. And CK is a digraph that is quite commonly taught in kindergarten. It certainly is in our work. And then notice that there's no picture here of a rock, because if there's a picture of a rock here, then what is the child going to do? They're likely to look at the picture, and then you won't know, did they decode that word or they just figure it out from the picture? Instead, you have to turn the page, and now you get to see the rock, and you get to see what's in it. And the picture is not going to give this word away, I would argue, right? And so here we have gem. And again, this is a consonant, short vowel consonant word that is decodable for kindergartners based on what they would have been taught in kindergarten. Similarly, in a den, a fox, and so on. So hopefully what you're seeing here, and I know that you might think, oh, wait, this gives them a clue to the word, but about half the time kids think that's a dog anyway. So I think it's not too much of a clue. Anyway, the point is that these are words that children can decode and with what they've been taught in kindergarten. So that is the idea here, is that those are the kinds of emergent reader texts that I would encourage you to be thinking about when you are thinking about what constitutes an emergent reader text. And then in terms of where was that question? Oh dear, sorry. Okay, and in terms of the question, how to best assess, you would have a set of those books, right? A set of books that have the characteristics I just talked about, and you would read them with the children and have a simple set of questions to go with them, such as, what do you think will happen next? Or what can you tell me about the book you just read? And that would help you know if kindergartners can read emergent text with purpose and understanding, which is that Common Core state standard. Okay, sorry, I'm just blathering on. Here we go. Okay, what's your opinion on win time? A 30-minute block where all tier 1 stops and an intervention block begins. All our school paras are responsible, at our school, paras are responsible for delivering instruction to all the students that are not receiving intervention. Okay, so I have there's a decent chance you all are going to want to really hate me after this response, but as I want to remind you all, I only respond to questions with my best understanding based on research, not trying to win a popularity contest. So the first thing I'll say is that opinion in this question is the right framing. What's your opinion on win time? Because there's actually very little research. There are, I did another search last night. There are some pieces that give schools advice about how to do win time. There are some dissertations, so unpublished, not peer-reviewed journal articles that have looked at win time, but it's not an area, interestingly, where there's been a lot of, rigorous peer-reviewed research yet. So this is basically my opinion, but I extrapolated from research on highly effective schools. I think you've heard me mention before, and I know you've heard other folks as well talk about research or a number of studies over the years that have looked at highly effective schools, including schools that are highly effective at developing literacy, to see what's going on in those highly effective schools. And to my memory and knowledge, going back and looking at a few of those, win is not a feature of those schools. Win time is not a feature of those schools. So we at least know that schools can be highly effective without win time, if that's helpful. Here are some of the questions and concerns that I have. One is, what are children not getting to make room for win time? So if we cease tier 1 instruction for all children for 30 minutes a day, what are they not getting? Again, research hasn't explored exactly that question, but we do have a fair amount of research to suggest that what usually goes when schools are looking for places to cut in the primary grades is science and social studies. And so that's a pretty good guess as to what is getting cut to make room. Now, I have heard educators say, well, our kids who are getting enrichment during win time get science and social studies. But let's think about that for a minute. So that means Kids who don't seem to need intervention are getting social studies and science instruction, while kids who do seem to need intervention are not getting social studies and science instruction. And yet, one of the most robust predictors of reading success in third grade is what you know, your vocabulary and your conceptual knowledge about the natural and social world. So the very kids who probably need, in many cases, a fair amount of vocabulary and content area instruction aren't getting it. So that's a concern. The second concern is a phenomenon that's very well documented in the research called comorbidity. I don't care for that term, but just in case you're familiar with it, that's sort of traditionally what it's been called. But it basically means that children who require or benefit from intervention often would benefit from multiple interventions. For example, kids who have difficulty with math are more likely to have difficulty with reading. And kids who have difficulty with reading in a number of cases are also kids who are having issues with self-regulation that require intervention and so on. And so what you end up with win time is like, you've got kids who are have intervention time who don't necessarily need it. And then you have kids who need multiple interventions who only get to get one. So that's a challenge. And finally, depending on how it's organized, win time doesn't necessarily maximize small group or interventionist time. So what I recommend to schools and districts is that you have your whole group time where the teacher's providing instruction whole group. And in most cases, you want children who would benefit from intervention to be in that whole group time. And then you move into, hopefully, if you're providing instruction aligned with research, you're moving into a time where there is small group work in math or small group in literacy. And when that small group time happens, and the teacher is pulling a group of children flexibly to work with them on a particular lesson, all the other kids are, doing things without a teacher right there with them. That's the time when you want your interventionist to pull out, or usually better yet, push in to work with kids in small group. And mathematically, if you have a good chunk of that small group time if you have a literacy block and a good chunk of that time in your math block, that's actually spreading out much more so opportunities for intervention and enabling kids to get multiple forms of intervention who need that, and actually creating a more robust than 30 minutes, potentially opportunity for certain children in terms of intervention. So that is my response to that question. Okay, moving on. Many Young 5 classrooms are looking to purchase curriculum, although we know they should be following kindergarten standards. Do we see any Young 5 programs successfully implementing pre-K or K programs? Do you have any suggestions to create a scope and sequence using the kindergarten standards for them? Love this question too. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about what a Young 5's program is. So in most of the districts that I interact with in Michigan, Young 5's is really most or all of the kids in Young 5's go to kindergarten the next year. Okay, it's not like, there are a few places that do this, but for the most part, it's not that the kids go to Young 5's and then there's like a branching and some of them move on to first and some move to kindergarten. That's typically not how it's being implemented. And I did verify that with some researchers who've been looking at Young 5's in Michigan, that it's a very small percentage of kids who go from Young 5's to first grade, or they've told me that. So, so if kids are going to go on to kindergarten the next year, then Young 5's is not kindergarten, it's pre-kindergarten. Like by definition, it's pre-kindergarten. They're going to go to kindergarten the next year. Developmentally, if you think that they should be getting a kindergarten curriculum, then you should put them in kindergarten. If you don't think they should be getting a kindergarten curriculum yet, because you didn't put them straight into kindergarten, they actually should be getting a rigorous pre-kindergarten curriculum. So what you shouldn't be doing is, in my opinion, is treating them just like you would treat a group of kindergartners who are going to go into first grade the next year. Okay. A few other things about Young 5's. It's so exciting that we have in Michigan people, as California does as well. These are two big pre-K or two big Young 5's / transitional kindergarten. That's the more common name for it. It's also called begindergarten. It's also called developmental kindergarten, junior kindergarten. There's a whole bunch of names for it. I'm going to call it transitional kindergarten, but I'm talking about what most of you think of when you think of young fives. Okay. Anyway, so we're very lucky that in Michigan, as in California, there are teams of researchers who are actually studying the effects of our programs that are transitional kindergarten. And so when you get these slides, you'll get a chance to, if you'd like to, take a look at some of the research on this. One thing that you'll see is that so far, our transitional kindergarten programs in Michigan are looking good in terms of having lasting positive effects into 3rd grade. So that's really exciting, just to see that this seems to be a move that is supportive of children's learning. There are, however, I really want to flag this, some concerns about the current implementation of transitional kindergarten in Michigan in certain respects exacerbating inequity. And this is because the pattern so far in Michigan is that districts that offer transitional kindergarten tend to be of higher socioeconomic status and to have fewer children of color than the districts that don't offer transitional kindergarten. So that's a phenomenon we need to be looking at very, very, very closely, especially now that we know that transitional kindergarten actually can work to support children's long-term development. Okay, but back to the question. So there actually is research. It's so great to have this in this case. If you look at page 17 of the document I've listed here from EPI at University of Michigan, they actually have a table with the most commonly used curricula in TK classrooms in Michigan. So you can take a look at what places are using. What they don't have yet is they haven't been able to get the data to the point where they can look at which curricula are associated with the greatest long-term gains for kids. And there are not, to my knowledge, any experimental studies where they've randomly assigned children in TK to different curricula and looked at how they do long-term. So we don't know really what curricula would be best. So I did text last night when I was prepping for this session. I did text Dr. Chris Weiland at University of Michigan, who's been involved in all of the studies that I've linked here. And she said, my hunch is a strong pre-K curriculum like Connect for Learning or Boston Focus would be a good pick. But we're seeing positive effects overall from the mix in our survey. So in other words, they're getting positive effects overall and people are using a wide range of curricula. Her best guess is that what you want is basically a more rigorous pre-K curriculum. But again, our research is limited. That's what I have for your very good question so far. Please ask again in a couple of years. I hope we'll know a lot more. All right, and this is the last question. So I'm going to address this question and then actually going to give you a little time to, I don't know if you can do breakouts, so either breakouts or chat-based work. But anyway, the question was, it's another great question, how and what might we gather as evidence a coaching cycle was successful around text sets? Great question. So I'm going to draw here from literature on PDSA cycles or Plan, Do, Study, Act cycles. I know that you're talking about coaching cycles. There's actually a fair amount of overlap between PDSA cycles and coaching cycles anyway. But I wanted to draw from this literature because I have a nice heuristic that I was able to glean from this literature that I want to share with you. But anyway, so just to make sure we're on the same page about Plan, Do, Study, Act cycles, this is Plan, Do, Study, Act. This is part of the large literature on improvement science. So again, you can see how similar it really is to what you would think of as a coaching cycle in many ways, but you're planning how you're going to test a change idea. Then you test the change idea. You collect data that will help you understand how that change idea was implemented and the impact it had. And then you make a series of decisions really based on that data that then lead you back to plan. And these are iterative experiences. So you would plan and do Study Act, you could go through many cycles of it, just as you go through many cycles of coaching often, to get to a broader goal. So, and this document, along with 2 other documents that I like in this area, are linked in the slides. I have no idea why I'm on that slide right now. That's really weird. Okay, I'm supposed to be here. All right. So I'm drawing from the Plan, Do, Study Act literature, and particularly that study portion of Plan, Do, Study Act, and share with you 3 kinds of data that you might collect. So the first is data on the implementation of the change idea. Now, a lot of times people want to jump right to what effect did it have on children? But we don't want to go all the way there yet. The first thing we want to know is how was it implemented? So if it's a coaching cycle that focuses on text sets, then you would be measuring things like, how many text sets you would met our criteria for a text set. You're starting to see in the out in the literature, I'm sure you're not guilty of this, but you're starting to see programs call things text sets that are like tangentially related at best. So, you have your image of what's a text set. And so you want to see if those, how often were the text sets really text sets, how many were implemented, how much time was spent on them, whatever the things are that you think are important with reference to the text sets. Personally, for me, if you're using the text set for read aloud, for example, I'd want to know, were they read with an interactive read aloud approach? Were they revisited over time? All those kind of things. Then you get to what's the impact. And here you would ideally want, in most cases, to be looking at the impact on children, because that's usually, what your goal was in your goal setting for the PDSA cycle. So you might, for example, if you did a series of text sets that were all about different habitats, then what you want to do is learn what children learned about habitats. And so you would have a survey that would get to that. Or if you were reading a text set that was designed to deepen children's knowledge of a particular cultural group, then you would want to have a survey or an interview or something that would enable you to learn about children's growing knowledge of that particular cultural group. And you want to make sure that when you're doing that, you're being practical about it. Like, it's probably not feasible to do a one-on-one interview with every single kid in the class about what they learned from every text set. But you can do things like pick a random sample of 4 children whom you ask, or ask everybody to draw a picture that shows as much as they can about what they've learned. Or, you want to stay practical, but you're trying here to get at children's learning. And then this is such an important thing that I have gleaned from the work on PDSA cycles that I've been promoting in other spots as well, which is to make sure you have measures of unintended impacts. So sometimes, we have a change idea and it works really well, but it has these unintended consequences. And if you're not looking out for those, then you may miss them. So I talked earlier about a common unintended consequence of win time is a reduced amount of science and social studies time at tier 1. So that would be an unintended impact. So you would think in this case, what could be unintended impacts of these text sets? And, off the top of my head, I can think of, if the text sets were not sufficiently representative of the children in the classroom, they weren't getting enough, mirrors as well as windows, that could be an unintended impact. Or if the time spent with text sets was displacing some other important activity or whatever. And I'm giving you negatives, but unintended impacts can also be really positive. So maybe an unintended impact of the text sets was that it encouraged children to do much more reading on that topic outside of the text set instruction, for example. So, unintended impacts can be both positive and negative. And you want to have those 3 pieces of data to then get to your ACT, part, which is where you're making decisions based on what you've learned. So my thinking was that in the time we had left, we would have the opportunity to maybe share some of our ideas about any of those three kinds of measures, and I can pop those three in the chat for you. And team, can folks go into random breakouts, or are there too many people for that?
Yeah, that doesn't work out so well anymore with 400 on
With so
Zoom.
many people. That's fair. I thought that might
But,
be the case. So I have a
but
backup plan, which is
yeah,
to invite people in the chat. So I'm putting
nice.
all three of those types of measures and invite people to do a little bit of reflecting individually, or if you're with a group in a room, to do a little bit of reflecting, trying to think of some of the measures that you could use. And I'm personally especially interested in ideas that you might have about measures of unintended impact of tech sets. Because I think, again, those unintended impacts can sometimes be what we are most likely to miss. So please go ahead and do some thinking. So while you all are thinking, I'm going to interrupt with just a couple of things from the chat. A golf-sized pencil are like, there's sometimes at putt-putts, they're real short and very, very skinny. They're used to like mark the scorecard. And again, I would not recommend that based on the research. And then there was a question about starting with uppercase versus lowercase letters. Great question. And this is one of these areas where they just can't make it easy for us, right? In the world. So uppercase letters in English, uppercase letters are much easier to form than lowercase letters. And so from a handwriting development perspective, you do want to teach uppercase letter formation first. But from the perspective of reading development, kids are going to see a lot more lowercase letters than uppercase letters. So from a learning to read point of view, if anything, you want more emphasis on lowercase. So you see how we have a conflict between our goals around handwriting and our goals around reading and writing, right? So what I recommend, and almost everybody I think almost everybody recommends this at this point, that when you're introducing the letters in pre-K, you do introduce both the upper and lowercase forms simultaneously. So you don't like teach all the uppercase and then teach all the lowercase. You teach, when you're teaching A, you teach the uppercase A and you teach the lowercase a at the same time. And when children are writing in pre-K, because again, we're not doing formal handwriting instruction, you're not really picking at them one way or another. So if they do uppercase, do uppercase, they do lowercase, whatever. In kindergarten, in their writing, you want them using lowercase as well as uppercase ASAP, as early as possible. So you start teaching, Common Core has specific capitalization norms that you were supposed to be teaching in kindergarten. But when they're doing their handwriting practice, when they're specifically doing their handwriting practice, we start with the uppercase. Does that distinction make sense? So it's not an elegant situation, but we don't have an elegant situation. I think if we all had it to do over again, we just would have made the lowercase the uppercase and the uppercase the lowercase. And it's much like we wouldn't have named WW. We would have named W way, and then we would have a much better situation there. And none of us would have named 11 11. We would have named it 10 1. So there are just a lot of things like that in our world that got established before people who knew about child development were in the mix, and so we're stuck with them. there's really, if you're not looking at it, you definitely should take a moment to check out the chat, because there are a lot of great ideas here from your colleagues about things that you can be looking for. Um, and also some good questions. Beth Hill says, must there always be pre-assessment to measure against? Good question, Beth. I mean, one real important characteristic of PDSA cycles and coaching cycles in the data collection you do there is that this is not a research project. So you don't have to do, you're not held to the same, expectations. It's like action research. It's not research like you're trying to get published in a peer-reviewed journal. And so, no, I think there are situations in which you don't need a pre-assessment to measure against whatever you're doing. There are just cases where that's just illogical. Like if you're doing a tech set on ancient Egypt, I think it's probably fair to say that most kids probably don't have a lot of ancient Egypt expertise going in. So I don't think you need to spend a bunch of time on a pre-assessment about what they know about ancient Egypt. So I don't think there always needs to be a pre-assessment to measure. Thank you. Okay, team, my next meeting has started. So never a dull moment. So it was good to be with all of you. Thanks again for the good questions, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.